Connecticut River, there is a picture of New England's serenity and prosperity. It's a town where hard-working families live and others want to.
It's one of the places, if you lived in a surrounding community, that's where you'd want to move. I'd like to move to South Hadley.
Successful town.
It is.
For a pretty Irish teenager, South Hadley, with its deep Irish roots, was a welcoming place at first, but then the good cheer faded.
If you didn't actually grow up there, you were considered an outsider. It takes a lot to just be a normal person.
It all led to something so horrible it would send chills through parents everywhere. But was what happened a crime? It would take months to unravel the mystery and understand what really took place here in South Hadley to a girl named Phoebe Prince. A girl who came of age in a very different part of the world, the stark but beautiful west coast of Ireland. This is where her story really begins.
She used to run out here in the waves?
Yes.
Playing here among the surf, the rocks, and the wildflowers she loved to pick.
An orchid?
It's over there. I'll show you.
Show me.
So Phoebe was all about the softer side of life.
An extraordinarily gentle child. When she was over here, she went on a boxing course, and she didn't like to hit the punch bag in case she hurt it.
Her dad, Jeremy Prince, says his daughter had so much going for her. She was adorable and smart and bubbly. Phoebe had every reason to be a happy child. She was raised in comfort by educated parents who inspired her love of the classics and writing.
She would come out of school bursting with enthusiasm, an essay to write, and this is what it's about.
It was also a family who taught her to appreciate the world beyond her doorstep. Here she is on vacation with her family in France. That's why the family's move to America back in the summer of 2009 seemed like such a good idea for Phoebe. Her American-born mother was offered a chance to teach for a year in the States. She would take her youngest daughter and Phoebe, then 14, on an American adventure, while their father stayed back in Ireland.
You weren't particularly concerned about her going to a new school and having to cope with a lot of change.
She was a pretty adaptable child. No, not concerned about that at all.
Besides, Phoebe had an aunt living in western Massachusetts to help them settle in. Eileen Moore says her sister and nieces found an apartment in nearby South Hadley. Phoebe loved the freedom she had.
She loved going down the street to Friendly's just to have that convenience, the whole American way of life.
Including high school. Phoebe was enrolled as a freshman at South Hadley High that fall. Eileen says she called the school asking for administrators to look out for Phoebe.
Can you please watch out for her, introduce her to some good kids, and keep an eye on her?
Eileen knew her niece was worried about fitting into her new school, but almost right away things clicked for Phoebe at South Hadley High.
Oh yeah, she fit in really fast.
Amy Bila and her daughter Lish lived on the first floor of a rental house with Phoebe and her family upstairs. They were struck by how fast she started making friends.
She's a beautiful girl and everything, but knowing what the high school kids are like or what the town is like, so it was nice to see that she was making friends fast.
But Amy did think it was odd that so many of Phoebe's friends were boys. And then later that fall, Phoebe let it slip that she, the new girl, had hit the high school jackpot. She'd taken up with a senior, a football player named Sean. Here he is talking to a local news website that year.
The team, the league just itself is going to be real strong this year. So.
How popular was Sean Mulvihill?
Very popular. Everyone knew him.
Big man on campus?
Oh yeah. Had a lot of friends.
And then, just like that, it was over in a high school minute. After a few weeks, Phoebe said she and Sean were a thing of the past. Her father says she was hurt, but by the time he came to visit right before Christmas, Phoebe seemed to be getting back to her old self, happy to be playing in the snow, opening presents. And when he left for Ireland after Christmas, she was beaming about something else, a big high school dance coming up in just a few weeks.
Phoebe was trying on her dress for going to the school dance. Because it's every girl's dream. It's what we bring our children up on. It's a Cinderella dream. Being the belle of the ball, wearing a lovely dress.
It's part of what makes what happened next so difficult for Jeremy Prince to fathom. It was the end of the second week of January 2010, just 2 days before that winter cotillion. The phone rang at his home in Ireland. It was news about Phoebe, but what he was hearing sounded preposterous.
Almost disbelief, except realizing that you can't disbelieve and make it go away, because it's actually happening.
Phoebe was dead. Someone was telling him she had hanged herself with a scarf in the stairway of their rental home in South Hadley. He remembers flying back to the U.S. in a daze to comfort his shattered family, especially his youngest daughter. She was the one who had found Phoebe's body.
She told me that she had tried to undo the knots around Phoebe's neck and couldn't.
What is it as a father, to hear that news? What races through your mind immediately?
I think natural defense mechanisms in the mind let you take it slowly, bit by bit, and realize the full horror of it.
And there was so much horror to absorb, especially when the rumors started. People in South Hadley were whispering the most unsettling stories about Phoebe's last days. They were saying that the young girl from Ireland, dead just 5 months after she'd come to America, had actually been driven by others to commit suicide. Phoebe Prince's aunt, Eileen Moore, remembers driving up to the little house on Newton Street that January night 2 years ago. Time slowed to a sickening crawl. Inside an ambulance, she found her youngest niece sobbing. She had just discovered her older sister Phoebe hanging in a stairwell.
I just hugged her and let her talk and cry and just let her talk and talk.
But even through the fog of tears, Eileen remembers hearing her sister, Phoebe's mother, talking to police, telling them why her daughter had just killed herself.
Phoebe had been, the girls were picking on her and being bullied.
Bullied. Phoebe's mother seemed convinced her daughter had been routinely tormented. On the day of her death, Phoebe's mom was telling police, here are some clues.
Yeah.
News of Phoebe's suicide had already spread all over town. When Eileen got home later that night, her daughter logged onto the internet and gasped in horror.
My daughter Molly saw horrific, nasty comments about Phoebe online, saying she deserved it, and there's quotes all over there, the Irish slut, it was horrific.
By the next day, Phoebe's grief-stricken friends were all talking about those vile things some classmates were saying about her in death. But they weren't surprised either, because they believed Phoebe had suffered in life, at school.
What I saw when I was in school is people would make fun of her. People would call her names, and I think it was just terrible.
Another classmate, Sergio Lubriel, said it seemed like some girls were threatened by the pretty, popular newcomer from Ireland.
She'd be walking by and they'd be like, no, you like cough and a slut, like that. Or they would say it to like make fun of her or get her embarrassed.
Investigation into whether a 15-year-old South Hadley High School student was bullied before she died continues.
Local reporters descended on South Hadley High. Was it true the young Irish girl, Phoebe Prince, had been bullied to death? And if so, by whom? What exactly had happened to her on the last day of her life?
How could this kid feel such despair that she would take a scarf that her little sister gave her for Christmas and hang herself?
Kevin Cullen is a columnist for the Boston Globe. Back in the 1980s, he helped break the story about the FBI protecting a known mob boss named Whitey Bulger. To Cullen, this case, set not on the gritty back streets of Boston, but the open hallways of South Hadley High, was in some ways just a different kind of mob story.
What I found remarkable is that when I started talking to the kids in the school, the story was incredibly consistent. that everybody kind of knew this was going on.
Everybody knew Phoebe was being harassed.
Not only that, he says, every kid seemed to know exactly who at school had bullied Phoebe. Her tormentors were still roaming the halls.
That led to a real chilling effect among other kids that knew what happened. They were afraid to come forward and say what they knew because, as they saw it, nothing was going to happen to the bullies because some of them were the most popular kids in that school.
But what bothered Cullen most was when he heard that Phoebe's classmates had held their annual school dance just 2 days after her death. Even Phoebe's fling, Sean Mulvihill, was there. Phoebe's dad, Jeremy, heard the news too and was sickened.
Incredibly, the school went ahead with that dance 2 days after she died. And Phoebe was wearing a lovely dress when they were dancing there that night. But the accessories were the flowers in the coffin with her.
So Kevin Cullen decided to take direct aim at the unnamed bullies. He wrote a critical column, The Untouchable Mean Girls, in which he described Phoebe's torment, the name-calling, the stalking, the intimidation at the hands of jealous classmates as relentless. And he wondered why the mean girls who tortured Phoebe remain in school, defiant, unscathed.
When you write that first piece, what kind of reaction do you get?
A lot of it was, you're bullying these kids. By pointing the finger at these kids,
you're bullying
the bullies by pointing this out.
But he also received a stream of emails supporting him. Either way, the Boston Globe's story had turned the death of a young girl in a small town into national news. And now, like so many others, Phoebe's father wanted answers. He said Cullen's column gave him hope that his daughter's death would not be ignored.
It meant, I think, that this won't be hushed. It meant, sorry, this is out in the open now.
The article made people wonder just how bad things had gotten for Phoebe. What really happened to her at South Hadley High? The local district attorney was one of those asking that question, and she was determined to find the answer. Was Phoebe Prince really bullied to death? It was the question on nearly everyone's mind in South Hadley in early 2010. But there was one woman who had the legal power to probe for answers.
This wasn't a case of sticks and stones.
Elizabeth Scheibel was the district attorney who investigated Phoebe's suicide. After weeks interviewing witnesses and combing through computer and phone records, she came to this conclusion, that Phoebe wasn't just bullied, but hounded by classmates shortly after she started at South Hadley High.
Our investigation revealed that it was, in fact, a campaign. A campaign of what? A campaign of tormenting? Of making her life miserable.
And the reason for Phoebe's misery, she says, grew out of teenage hormones, social power, and jealousy. Phoebe, the cute new girl in school, was a threat to some of the older girls. Beth Dunphy Ferris also worked on the case.
Throughout the months preceding her death, from mid-November to early January, we identified 2 separate groups for which the motivation to bully Phoebe was her brief romantic relationships with males.
It began roughly 2 months before her death, when Phoebe and that football player, Sean, he's number 25, ended their brief romance in November. The prosecutor says Phoebe soon realized that she'd been duped, that Sean had had a sometime girlfriend while he'd been seeing Phoebe. Phoebe went to the girl named Kayla to apologize.
But it sort of backfires on her. It did backfire on her because that's when Kayla became angry, as did Sean, because Sean had not shared with Kayla the extent of the relationship with Phoebe.
Phoebe had just made the most popular boy look like a cheater, and he was furious. Prosecutors say he began encouraging friends to badmouth the new girl.
What did it do to her? She was devastated. She was absolutely devastated.
After Sean and his friends turned on her, Phoebe made another mistake. She began seeing a different senior boy who also had a girlfriend. And when that girlfriend found out about Phoebe, all hell broke loose. It was the first week of January 2010 when the girl blurted this out in class.
That Phoebe should get her ass kicked.
The prosecutors say Phoebe was terrified because the girl she angered had friends like Sharon Chan Velasquez who wanted to make sure Phoebe got the message. Sharon confronted Phoebe in the hallway and in the cafeteria. In a panic, Phoebe went to report the incident to a vice principal but was told to return to class. Later, Sharon came up to her again. In a face-off, Phoebe's Latin teacher witnessed and reported.
It was very clear that they were not having a conversation. Phoebe was in a defensive position, and Sharon was in her face with her finger pointing.
Sharon was suspended for 1 day, but there was more abuse coming, this time from the first group, Sean and his friends. It was a week later, January 14th, the last day of Phoebe's life. Phoebe had been studying in the school library. Sean and his girlfriend were also there, along with another girl, who suddenly began shouting at Phoebe.
Screaming what? Bitch and Irish slut and things of that nature. The same terminology that had been consistently used.
Witnesses recalled Sean urging his friend to beat up Phoebe. Later that afternoon, the prosecutors say Phoebe saw the same 3 kids again in a hallway filled with students. As Phoebe walked by, Sean's friend started back in.
Began to make comments of close your legs, you're a slut.
Even then, it wasn't over. As Phoebe left the building and walked the block toward her house, the final insult was hurled, literally, by Sean's friend.
Came by as a passenger in a car and threw an empty energy can at Phoebe while Phoebe was walking home, and then texted Sean and told him what she had just done.
And what did Sean say?
Text back, haha.
What happened next is far from clear, but this much is known. Phoebe arrived home after 2 p.m. She started texting friends.
She says at one point that Sean should know better than anyone what she's going through or has gone through. And at one point, Phoebe texts, they might as well have handed me the noose.
Hours later, police were removing Phoebe's body from the stairwell of her house. To Scheibel, it was clear Phoebe's tormentors had driven her to despair. And yet there was a problem. There was no law against bullying in Massachusetts at that time. No easy way to press charges. Or was there?
There was no obvious thing to go to and say, okay, we're going to charge them with bullying. So what do you charge them with?
Charge them with existing criminal statutes that fit. The grand jury returned felony indictments against the following individuals.
More than 2 months after Phoebe's death, 5 students were charged with violating Phoebe's civil rights. Sean and another boy, Austin Renault, were each charged with statutory rape. All pleaded not guilty, but if convicted at trial, they were looking at possible jail time.
Were you trying to make an example of these kids?
Absolutely not. We were seeking that the individuals take responsibility for their actions and to be accountable for their actions.
The charges scored headlines around the world. Many saw it as an unprecedented prosecution of teens who bullied. And yet the district attorney did not file charges against any school officials, saying their actions didn't rise to a criminal level. But that didn't sit well with many in South Hadley. At school board meetings, they protested.
You know they dropped the ball, they blew it, and everybody knows they blew it.
Some even demanded the principal and superintendent resign immediately.
When one of our kids dies, we do not give a second chance, and we're not going to.
But there would be no immediate resignations, no speedy trials. In fact, there was a lot more to this case. The school itself and an investigative reporter were about to tell the other side of what they saw as a far more complicated story than the one the DA had written. months after Phoebe Prince's suicide, 6 of her classmates were facing potential criminal convictions and possible jail time in connection with her death. The news rocked this quiet, middle-class suburb and left one man in particular with a lot of explaining to do.
As an educator, working many, many years in education, I've never seen such a thing happen to students.
Former school superintendent Gus Sayer has been the lightning rod for critics who say adults at South Hadley High didn't do enough to protect Phoebe Prince. Kevin Cullen is a columnist for the Boston Globe.
I just find it hard to believe that no one in a position of authority, no adult in that school knew that Phoebe was being persecuted, because it was such common knowledge among the kids. I don't accept that teachers and administrators didn't have at least a whiff of this. It begs the question, if you don't know what's going on, are you doing your job?
But Sayer insists his school staff had no idea that Phoebe was feeling so tormented by other students.
Phoebe endured an incredible amount, according to what we're finding out. But she was an unusual person. She apparently bore most of it to herself.
After an internal investigation, Sayer concluded that Phoebe was, in fact, bullied. But he also suggests that the bullying might not have been the only problem that pushed Phoebe to take her own life.
We were aware of some things, which I cannot talk to you about, that would have changed her demeanor, aside from the bullying.
He says he can't go into more detail, citing confidentiality concerns, but someone else was about to.
I assumed this was a school with a huge problem.
Emily Bazelon is a senior editor with Slate.com. She started following the case shortly after Phoebe's death.
I was really interested in looking at how a pack of kids could be allowed to really terrorize other kids in the way that had been described.
But as she started digging, she got a different picture. She says kids she interviewed suggested the DA had exaggerated the extent of the bullying Phoebe endured. And then she got hold of court documents that had been presented to the grand jury, which indicted those 6 teens. She says the records put Phoebe's death in a new light.
It was really tricky to decide what to do with that information, because a lot of it had to do with the mental health history of Phoebe Prince, who was this girl who had tragically killed herself.
She says the documents revealed a girl in crisis well before her death. For one thing, Bazelon found Phoebe had a history of clashing with other students, going back to her days in boarding school in Ireland.
And I also learned that she had been involved in bullying herself, of another girl in particular about whom she had written some quite mean things.
So being the tormentor as opposed to the victim of bullying.
Right.
On top of that, Bazelon says, Phoebe was being treated for mental health issues. She'd been sent to a counselor in Ireland and put on medication.
Phoebe had a troubled history of depression.
And you see that and you think, well, maybe that's part of the reason.
Right,
what happened.
Because depression is a strong predictor of suicide.
Bazelon says Phoebe's depression was so serious that the teen tried to commit suicide weeks before her death. She says Phoebe's first attempt happened just after her breakup with that football player, Sean Mulvihill, and before the worst of the bullying began.
She swallowed a bottle of Seroquel, which is a mood disorder drug. She was in the hospital for a week with organ failure, so it was a serious suicide attempt.
Bazelon broke the story about Phoebe's mental history as the cases against the 6 students were still working their way through the courts. When you published that first piece, what was the response?
The response was dramatic. It changed the public narrative of the case. The district attorney responded, and
not favorably.
Not favorably.
Phoebe's father was outraged. For one thing, he says Phoebe did not try to kill herself in November. Yes, she was troubled, and yes, she swallowed those pills, but he says she immediately realized her mistake and told her mother about it.
Did you consider it a suicide attempt?
No, I consider this a cry for help.
As for Phoebe seeing counselors, he says that was true, but he denies that his daughter was put on medication in Ireland, or that she was clinically depressed, or that she was ever a bully. He feels Bazelon used the court records to tell a misleading story.
She was using them very, very selectively. not to paint a true picture at all, but to do a completely distorted picture of Phoebe.
And that distorted picture was that Phoebe was mentally troubled for many years.
Yes.
But Bazelon stands by her reporting.
I tried really hard not to blame the victim. I tried hard to explain what had happened to Phoebe and to take blame out of the picture for a moment. You know, this is still a very sad story. It's just not the sad story that we were originally told.
And that's exactly how someone else sees it. Accused bully Sharon Chan Velasquez, one of the 6 students charged, was ready to add her voice to this case, to explain in detail what she believes she did and didn't do to the new girl at South Hadley High. Of all the lessons learned at South Hadley High, there's one that will always haunt accused bully Sharon Chan Velasquez, and it didn't come from a teacher or a textbook.
Don't judge a book by its cover, and just think before you do things. Because I didn't think when I got mad, and I mean, look where I am now.
That would be in trouble.
Is there anything you want to say to Phoebe? Absolutely no comment.
Sharon knows some people see her as one of a handful of kids who bullied a girl to death. But once again, she says, don't judge a book by its cover.
I was always the nice, bubbly person that always talked to everybody. I was really friendly. But when people heard that just because I argued with her, they changed their minds about me.
Joined by her mother, Angeles, and her lawyer, Sharon agreed to sit down with NBC's Ann Curry for an exclusive primetime interview to tell her side of the story. Sharon's mother says her daughter is not that mean girl you've read or heard about.
She's the type of girl that if you're in pain, she will be next to you. If you need to cry, she will tell you, I will cry with you.
Then again, says Sharon, that impulse to help a friend is what landed her in this mess. Sharon claims that when she found out Phoebe was seeing her friend's boyfriend, Austin, she went up to Phoebe to talk things over calmly.
I approached her very nicely, and I was like, are you and Austin doing anything? Are you guys together? And she was like, you know, from there it kind of escalated, because I guess she got mad and then I got mad.
But Sharon could not let it rest. The next day she confronted Phoebe again, this time in the cafeteria.
And you said what to her that you wish you hadn't said?
The whore, and it's like, and that's like when we started arguing for real, because she was like, well, you don't know me, and it got bad.
So bad, other students joined in. Sharon says they told her to beat Phoebe up. In a fury, she followed Phoebe to the hallway outside Latin class.
I'm yelling, she's yelling.
Swear words?
Yeah.
The B word, the W word, all the words.
After she was suspended for that outburst, Sharon says she never approached Phoebe again. By that time, though, she says other students were also bad-mouthing the girl from Ireland.
And this was widely discussed in the school.
A lot of people would snicker and they would say mean things about her. It was just like that. She was just sleeping around with people's boyfriends, and they would give her dirty looks.
She says a lot of kids trash-talked Phoebe. That's why she was stunned when classmates started pointing the finger of blame at her for Phoebe's death.
What were they saying about you?
That I was glad that she died, that I didn't care, that I hit her, that I wanted, that if I didn't hit her yet, that I wanted to fight her, and none of that was true.
But the worst was still to come. She remembers that moment more than 2 months later when her mother showed up, frantic, at school. She was telling Sharon that she, others, were being criminally charged in Phoebe's death.
I remember freaking out, and I was like, I don't know what I'm going to do. I don't know what I'm going to do. I mean, I know I didn't do anything.
It was scary just to think about, what about if she go to jail? I was like, I don't know if I'm going to be able to handle it.
Suddenly, reporters were swarming the family's house, neighbors were shunning them, and total strangers were emailing hateful things. Someone vandalized her house.
They threw a rock through the window. They break the window.
Yeah, it was smashed. And there was a bullet to it, so we found the bullet shell, so we didn't know if they shot first and then threw a rock, we didn't know.
Sharon blames herself for causing her family such shame and trauma, but she does not blame herself for Phoebe's death. She insists she's not a bully who hounded Phoebe.
But how are you not a part of that situation?
Because I argue with her. You can't bully someone from arguing. I see bullying as constantly going after someone, and I didn't want to go after her because that wasn't my intentions.
And yet, she does wish she could take back everything she said to Phoebe.
If you could speak to Phoebe, what would you say?
That I'm sorry, and I didn't know everything that you were going through, and I would have tried to help. Because she didn't deserve any of the things that happened to her.
Her lawyer, Colin Keefe, says what his client and others said to Phoebe was wrong, but that doesn't justify what the prosecutors have done.
But for them then to take it from there and to try to hold her criminally responsible for the death of someone who unfortunately took their own life was quite frankly outrageous.
But would a jury see it that way? It was becoming even more confusing to parcel out blame. Had the students charged bullied Phoebe to death, or were they blameless? An expert in bullying and a grieving family were about to offer surprising answers. As their criminal cases work their way through the courts,
do they need to fit the Prince family?
The students charged in connection with Phoebe Prince's death came to be known as the South Hadley Six, and their namesake town became a symbol of intolerance.
South Hadley was going to go through a very difficult time because it was going to feel like the entire world was looking at them.
Rosalind Wiseman knows a thing or two about bullies. She's a nationally recognized expert who wrote what many consider the book on the subject. In fact, after Phoebe's death, the DA and the South Hadley school system invited Wiseman in to talk with school staff about bullying.
Honest to goodness, these things are happening all over the country. So it is not a South Hadley problem.
National figures show at least 1 in 5 high school kids is bullied in the course of a year. Wiseman says the truth about bullying is that things get very messy very quickly. To some people, she says, it may even seem like Phoebe herself contributed to her grief by attracting boys who already had girlfriends. But that, says Wiseman, cannot become an excuse.
Does it justify or rationalize or excuse unbelievably cruel behavior? Absolutely not. Absolutely not.
And make no mistake, she says, what happened to Phoebe was bullying, and it was nothing less than cruel. But she largely blames the adults at South Hadley High for not doing enough to help a vulnerable girl.
She had a big red target on her. She was new, she was cute, she was reporting that she was being harassed, and the people in positions of leadership did not stop it.
But school teachers and administrators weren't facing possible jail time. 6 students were. And then early last year, the case against them took another turn. A new district attorney was sworn into office.
We did not enter these cases with any preset notions or any agenda.
Stephen Gagney was the assistant DA now assigned to the case. He knew some people thought his office should just drop the charges, that the accused had been punished enough in the public square. But that was not going to happen.
These were crimes. So we were trying to achieve as much of a sense of justice as we could, knowing that there was no such thing as perfect justice in this case.
But did that sense of justice mean jail time? He says it was Phoebe's parents who offered the most compelling, and some would say surprising, answer to that.
I would never have wanted people to be jailed. I do not think society or anyone gains anything by sending young people into prison.
You know, some people might hear that and think, are you kidding me?
In the end, they showed no compassion. I think the best response to that is to show some compassion yourself.
And yet the Princes still wanted the teens held accountable, so the new DA offered a solution, a plea deal that replaced the most serious charges against 5 of the students with milder ones. No jail time, limited probation, and community service. Both charges of statutory rape against the boys were dropped.
Please state your full name and age. Sean Mobile, 18 years old. How far did you go on school, sir? Senior year.
In exchange, the students had to admit their roles in tormenting Phoebe. Last May, they stood one by one before a judge and did just that.
Basically, the bullies have been forced to stand up and admit what they did in court. These were our actions.
Some, like Sharon Velasquez, wept openly or said nothing. Sean Mulvihill, the boy Phoebe once cared so much for, showed no emotion at all, even as Phoebe's mother read one of her daughter's final text messages about Sean just before she killed herself.
I think Sean condoning this is one of the final nails in my coffin. It would be easier if he or any one of them handed me a noose.
But two of the accused did give the princes the one thing they wanted most of all. Two simple words. I'm sorry.
I am sorry, Phoebe. I am sorry for the unkind things I said to others about you. I am sorry about the unkind posting on my Facebook page.
One of those offering apologies was Sean's old girlfriend, Kayla. The other was this girl, the one who insulted Phoebe so viciously in the library and threw an empty can at her on the last day of her life. To these two girls, Jeremy Prince makes an unusual offer.
I suppose if they ever wanted to meet me, I would not refuse.
You would not refuse?
No. If they're feeling really genuine remorse, they have a healing process to go through as well. I wouldn't wish to impede that. And as for the ones who have shown no remorse, no thank you.
Yet if he's still angry with some of the teens, he's downright bitter toward the adults at South Hadley High. He believes they neglected his daughter's safety. Phoebe's parents have since settled a civil claim against the school district for $225,000. They hope their daughter's death prods parents and educators into making sure schools are kinder, gentler places for every child, where abuse of any kind is never tolerated. They were heartened when Massachusetts passed a law months after Phoebe's death. It requires school officials statewide to investigate any claims of bullying. Lawmakers said they were galvanized to act, in large part, because of what happened to Phoebe.
Do you draw any comfort from that?
Yes, very definitely. It's in a way, it's a memorial to our child.
It's her legacy in a way.
I'm just hoping that it won't cease now, that it will go on, and someone else will take up the cudgels to get effective anti-bullying legislation through.
And that, says Jeremy Prince, is a worthwhile fight. But he doesn't want to be the face of it. He wants to be left alone now that his family is back in Ireland. He wants to focus on Phoebe's younger sister and to remember, with fondness, the daughter he lost. There are images he can't let go of a happier Phoebe playing in the water or on the rocks among the wildflowers of home.
She loved picking flowers, wearing them in her hair. As you go for a walk, she'd always come back with a bunch of flowers, and I always picture her as having flowers in her hand.